Rose never loved Charlie. She owned him. Rose is introduced in the pilot as a one-night stand who doesn't leave. The show frames her as comic relief, a harmlessly obsessive woman whose fixation on Charlie is played for laughs across 12 seasons. But the actual documented timeline of her behavior, assembled in sequence rather than scattered across individual episodes, describes something the laugh track was specifically designed to prevent audiences from naming correctly. Rose placed a restraining order violation on record before the end of season 1. She glued Charlie's anatomy to his own body during a moment of vulnerability. She invented an entire fictional boyfriend to manipulate Charlie's emotions, sustaining the fiction long enough to alter his behavior. She dressed as a bride to terrorize Charlie's actual fiancé. She staged a fake pregnancy to destabilize Walden's relationship years after Charlie was gone. And most damningly, the show eventually confirms that after Charlie disappeared in Paris, Rose kept him imprisoned in a hole underground for 4 years. Not metaphorically, literally, a man in a hole for 4 years. And the show's own characters, at Charlie's funeral, openly state their belief that Rose killed him. Berta delivers the line with a directness the laugh track almost drowns out. Never cross a crazy woman. The theory says Rose never lost control of her obsession. She executed it with clinical precision across a decade. And the only reason she was never charged with anything is that the show needed her back for the next episode. Alan's entire life was a long con? Alan Harper presents himself to everyone around him as the world's most hapless, pitiful, perpetually victimized man. Divorced, broke, professionally stagnant, emotionally needy, dependent on his brother's charity for housing and food across nearly a decade. The show built his entire comedic identity around this portrait of spectacular, sustained failure. And the theory says every single element of that portrait was engineered deliberately. Alan is not incompetent. He is strategic. Watch what he actually accumulates across the show's run while performing total helplessness. He lives rent-free in a multi-million-dollar Malibu beach house for years without contributing meaningfully to its costs. He extracts financial support from his brother, from his girlfriends, from Walden after Charlie dies, from anyone whose sympathy he can sustain long enough to make the arrangement comfortable. His chiropractic practice runs long enough to establish a Ponzi scheme that defrauds real patients, an act that requires significantly more planning than incompetence allows. And at the end of the series, Alan inherits the beach house entirely. A man who spent 12 seasons performing victimhood as his primary personality trait ends up with the single most valuable asset any character in the show possessed. The theory says Alan didn't stumble into that outcome. He built toward it from the moment he moved in, using the one tool available to someone who understood that people protect what they pity. He made himself impossible to abandon and waited for everyone useful to him to eventually leave him everything. Charlie was already dead before Paris. The official story of Charlie Harper's death is delivered secondhand, filtered through Rose's account, unverified by any independent witness, and accepted without question by characters who had every reason to be skeptical of the woman delivering it. Charlie died in Paris, pushed in front of a train, by Rose, or near a train, or maybe not by Rose. The details shift depending on which version of events Rose is currently offering, and the show never provides a body, a coroner's report, or any concrete forensic confirmation of the death itself. The theory built around this absence goes further than simply questioning whether the death happened the way Rose described. It argues that Charlie, who had been spiraling visibly across the show's final seasons, may have been functionally dead long before Paris in every way that mattered. His drinking had moved past recreational into something the show's own writers acknowledged as a portrait of genuine alcoholism. His relationships had collapsed into patterns so repetitive they stopped resembling choice and started resembling compulsion. His music career had stalled. His identity had narrowed to the point where the beach house, the piano, and the rotating door of women were the only remaining structures holding him together. The theory says the man who got on the plane to Paris with Rose was already someone who had stopped expecting to come back. Whether the train was real or metaphorical, Charlie Harper ended long before the show told you he did. Berta has been running the house all along. Berta, the housekeeper, occupies a position in the Harper household that the show consistently frames as low status, underpaid, and entirely peripheral to the real action of the series. She cleans. She makes sardonic observations. She collects a paycheck from men who treat her as scenery. and she has somehow maintained complete financial stability across the entire run of the show, despite working for two of the most financially chaotic men in Malibu. The theory starts with what Berta's actual position in that house grants her. She has unsupervised access to every room, every document, every private conversation, and every secret either Harper brother has generated across 12 seasons. She witnesses infidelities, financial crimes, legal vulnerabilities, and personal humiliations that a less observant person would simply clean around and forget. Berta does not forget. The episode in which she asks Alan to deliver money to a man named Shermy, who responds by attempting to shoot Alan, establishes that Berta operates within a financial network that extends well beyond Malibu housekeeping. She is connected to people who take money seriously enough to produce weapons over it. The theory says Berta has been extracting value from proximity to the Harper family's chaos for years. Leveraging information, maintaining relationships the show never bothers to illuminate, and returning each morning with the unshakable stability of someone who has made arrangements that don't depend on either brother's continued goodwill or financial competence. Jake was deliberately kept stupid. Jake Harper's cognitive limitations are the show's most consistent source of cheap comedy across 12 seasons. He misunderstands basic concepts. He fails academically without consequence. He develops into an adult whose intellectual ceiling the show treats as a fixed, inherent characteristic rather than something with a cause worth examining. The theory examines the cause. Jake is raised between two households, both of which are, in their own distinct ways, functionally catastrophic environments for a developing child's intellectual growth. Charlie's house is a rotating carnival of adult dysfunction, where boundaries are absent, consequences are non-existent, and the primary male role model spends his days drinking, sleeping with strangers, and avoiding every form of responsibility the outside world attempts to impose on him. Alan's relationship with Jake, when he has primary custody, centers almost entirely on using Jake as an emotional support system for his own anxieties rather than providing the stable, structured environment a child actually needs to develop normally. Neither man ever sits down with Jake to do homework, build a skill, or demonstrate that intellectual effort produces meaningful reward. The theory's darkest layer is not that Jake was neglected accidentally. It's that both men, on some unconscious level, found Jake's limitations convenient. A smarter Jake would have asked harder questions about both households. A smarter Jake would have made demands neither man was equipped to meet. The Jake the show gave audiences was the Jake that Charlie and Alan's combined failures inevitably produced. Walden was sent to destroy the house. Walden Schmidt arrives at the Harper Beach House in Season 9 as a billionaire tech founder having a breakdown, suicidal, having walked into the ocean fully clothed, discovered by Alan on the beach. The show uses his arrival to pivot the series after Charlie's departure, establishing Walden as a naive, emotionally open foil to Alan's cynicism. The theory looks at what Walden actually does to the house over the seasons following his arrival and constructs a picture that reads less like a lost billionaire finding himself and more like a man systematically dismantling everything the Harper brothers built. He renovates the house to the point where it barely resembles the structure Charlie lived in. He replaces the furniture, the aesthetic, the domestic rhythms, and eventually, the entire occupancy arrangement. He brings in his own relationships, his own emotional needs, his own history of spectacular personal failure dressed up in better clothes than Alan could afford, and he gradually transforms the space that defined Charlie Harper's entire identity into something neither Harper would recognize. The theory says Walden's arrival wasn't accidental. He was sent there, either by Rose, by Evelyn, or by some other party with a vested interest in ensuring that nothing of Charlie's actual life survived long enough to be reclaimed. A grieving man who purchases a dead man's house and immediately begins erasing every trace of him isn't healing. He's completing someone else's project. Charlie's ghost never left the house. Jake is not the only person to suggest that the Malibu beach house has an unusual relationship with the women who enter it. In What a Lovely Landing strip, Jake observes with startling directness that the house seems to be built on some kind of angry woman burial ground, an observation the show plays as a joke from the mouth of someone too dim to intend philosophical weight. The theory takes Jake's observations seriously, not literally, but as the most accurate description available of a phenomenon the show documents across 12 seasons without ever naming. Every woman who becomes significantly attached to the beach house undergoes some version of the same transformation. Judith enters the orbit of the Harper family and calcifies into an instrument of sustained cruelty toward Alan. Evelyn, already formidable, becomes progressively colder in proportion to how much time she spends in the house. Charlie's parade of women leave the house measurably worse than they arrived. Walden's ex-wife Bridget, stable and functional before her connection to the house's history, begins behaving erratically after spending time in its vicinity. The theory says Charlie Harper is still in that house. Not as a ghost in the conventional horror sense, but as a residue, an emotional weather system generated by a decade of a specific man's specific dysfunction, soaked into the walls, the furniture, the air circulating through every room. The house doesn't haunt women. Charlie does, and he's been doing it long after the show sent him to Paris and pretended he was finished. Evelyn was the real villain all along. Both Harpers spend the entire series positioning their mother Evelyn as the primary source of every dysfunction either of them carries into adulthood. Charlie's alcoholism, his avoidance of commitment, his inability to sustain any relationship that makes real emotional demands on him, Alan's neurotic neediness, his compulsive people-pleasing, his complete inability to function independently as an adult. Both men trace their damage directly to Evelyn, and the show largely validates this attribution without seriously examining what Evelyn's own story actually looks like from the inside. The theory does that examination. Evelyn Harper raised 2 children alone, following the departure of a husband the show implies was not significantly better than either of the men she produced. She built a successful real estate career in an era when professional women faced structural resistance the show occasionally acknowledges in passing. She maintained her presence in both sons' lives across decades, during which neither son made that presence comfortable or welcome. And she did all of this while being coded by the show, consistently and without ambiguity, as the villain of every scene she inhabits. The theory says Evelyn is not a villain. She is a woman who made choices under pressure that produced damaged children, who has spent 30 years being blamed for outcomes she didn't cause alone, by men who found it easier to point at their mother than to examine their own choices. The show never gave her a real defense. It just kept letting her sons testify against her. The house cursed everyone who stayed. The Malibu Beach house is the one constant across 12 seasons of 2.5 Men. Characters come and go. Relationships begin and collapse. Jobs are gained and lost. But the house remains, and the theory tracks what happens to every person who lives inside it for an extended period with the kind of systematic attention the show never applied to its own recurring location. Charlie lives in the house from the beginning and dies by the series finale. His physical and psychological deterioration, documented across 9 seasons in enough detail that the show's own writers eventually acknowledged they were portraying something darker than a bachelor's colorful lifestyle. Alan moves in temporarily in Season 1 and never recovers the ability to function independently outside its walls, his competence and confidence declining in near-perfect inverse proportion to the length of his stay. Walden, previously a functioning billionaire capable of building and selling companies worth hundreds of millions of dollars, begins making progressively worse decisions in proportion to how deeply he embeds himself in the house's rhythms. Berta alone survives with her faculties intact, a detail the theory uses as supporting evidence. She cleans the house. She does not live in it. The theory says the house is not simply a location, it is a mechanism. A structure so thoroughly saturated with the accumulated consequences of a specific kind of avoidant, self-destructive masculinity that it produces those same consequences in everyone who stays long enough to absorb them. Charlie didn't destroy his life. The house did, and Alan walked into it voluntarily and stayed until there was nothing left of him that existed separately from what the house needed him to be. Alan's son knew everything. Jake Harper consistently performs the role of the family's lovable idiot, the child whose innocence about adult situations provides the show's writers with a convenient source of comedy across 12 seasons. But the theory tracks the moments when Jake's observations cut through the comedy with an accuracy no genuinely oblivious person should be capable of achieving, and arrives at a conclusion the show deliberately avoided, stating, directly, Jake knows. He has always known. His observation about the angry woman burial ground is the most cited piece of evidence, but the theory extends further. Jake's periodic, seemingly accidental insights into the dynamics between his father and Charlie, between his mother and her parade of replacements, between Alan and money, between Charlie and the women who leave, consistently land closer to the actual truth of each situation than the observations of adults who have far more information and context available to them. The theory says Jake's stupidity is performance, not unlike Alan's helplessness, constructed as the only safe identity available to a child surrounded by adults who would have been deeply uncomfortable with a son and nephew who was actually paying close attention to everything they were doing. A smart Jake would have required honesty from people who had organized their entire lives around avoiding it. A dim Jake could be managed. The theory says Jake chose manageable. And somewhere underneath the failed grades and the empty expressions, the boy who noticed the house was built on angry women was watching everything, filing it away, and choosing, very carefully, what he was going to pretend he hadn't understood. Charlie's music was a suicide note. Charlie Harper is a jingle writer. For a man whose life contains as much chaos, talent, and self-destruction as Charlie's documented history across 9 seasons, jingles are a strange professional ceiling. He is demonstrably gifted at the piano. He has compositional instincts the show occasionally allows him to display in full before quickly cutting away to the next joke. And yet he spends his career writing 30-second advertising songs for products he doesn't care about, paid well enough to sustain his lifestyle, but never pushing past the boundary into work that would require him to actually say something true about himself through music. The theory says this professional choice is not simply laziness or the comfortable gravitational pull of easy money. It is avoidance elevated to a life strategy. Charlie Harper is terrified of what would emerge if he sat at the piano and wrote something real. The jingles are the safe version of his talent, contained, commercial, about nothing personal, delivered, and forgotten. The theory tracks his piano playing in the episodes where he is most emotionally exposed and finds a consistent pattern. He plays differently when he thinks nobody is listening. The music the show allows Charlie, when he believes himself unobserved, is not jingle music. It is something darker and more honest and considerably harder to laugh at. The theory says Charlie knew exactly what he was capable of writing if he let himself go there. And he spent 9 seasons writing everything except that, because the version of himself that could write it was the version he had been drinking hard enough to keep quiet for 30 years. The finale was Rose's final performance. The 2.5 Men finale has been widely criticized as one of the most deliberately provocative endings in sitcom history, a sequence in which a Charlie Sheen lookalike is crushed by a falling piano and Chuck Lorre's name appears on screen while the debris settles. The show framed it as a creator's revenge fantasy against a departed star. The theory looks past the meta-commentary and examines what the finale actually confirms about Rose, the only character whose actions across 12 seasons were never genuinely resolved or held accountable by the show's narrative structure. In the finale, Rose orchestrates the delivery of a piano to the beach house, an instrument that subsequently falls and kills the man everyone believes is Charlie attempting to return. She coordinates this event with the same methodical precision she has applied to every other significant manipulation across the show's run. She is present, she is calm, and she delivers her exit with the same self-possessed certainty she has carried since the pilot. The theory says the finale isn't Chuck Lorre having the last word on Charlie Sheen. It's the show, finally, in its last 5 minutes, allowing Rose to complete the arc it had been building around her since episode 1. She didn't lose Charlie to Paris. She didn't lose him to Walden, or Alan, or any of the women who came before her. She concluded him on her own terms, with a piano, in front of witnesses, and walked off screen, with the only ending available to someone who had spent 12 seasons refusing to accept any conclusion she didn't personally author. Subscribe, because there are more of these, and the next one might change how you watch this show entirely.